think I can safely say he's now an old friend of mine. I'm not talking about his age, but the length of our acquaintance. Don, as many of you may know, has written a lot of wonderful things on informal logic. He's also written wonderful paper on Frank Ebersol. We'll hear more about that later in the week. But I guess I'll just introduce Don by borrowing a distinction from Samuel Johnson. Don's a man I respect both for his literature and his work.
It's been a long time since I thought I wrote anything in this area, maybe 20, 25 years. And the paper that's emerged tried to cannibalize some of the work I did 25 years ago. So it really should have been titled 5 Subjects in Search of Paper. When it comes to our subject, called Argumentation Theory, what's striking is that it doesn't have the problem that the rest of philosophy does. The rest of philosophy, there are no examples. In this subject, there are lots of examples, and there are lots of examples in my paper. The problem is that most of the examples are contrived. And partly this is due to the fact that when you want to give an example of an actual argument, sometimes the arguments go on and on and on and on, and then you have no paper because the argument takes over, the example takes over. But more significantly, when people do cite an actual argument, they destroy the voice or eliminate the voice of the argument. They paraphrase it, they improve on it, they do what I did for 30 or 40 years as a teacher. I told students what their argument was, empowering me tremendously and totally depriving them of any power at all. I was right in what I said there are. And you know, when they protested about it, I thought they were crazy. That's not my argument, they would say. And of course, they were wrong. So the variety and the number of different contexts of argumentation present a considerable obstacle to theorizing. I'm not saying it undermines the possibility of theory, but it certainly makes you think twice about it. In my earlier writings, when I wrote about argumentation, I chose letters to the editor of the newspaper, letters to gossip, not to gossip, to advice columnists, and of course essays from argumentation theory, from books and essays, examples, I mean. I also talked about advertisements and other kinds of appeals. And I talked about something that you never find talked about in logic books, except to say that we're not interested in it. The kind of arguments that people get into that might bring them to a marriage counselor. Squabbles. Arguments between parents and kids. Where really, if you're a parent, the point is not to continue the argument, because that's what the kid wants. As long as the argument is going on, the kid wins. And a lot of times, it's important in the words of Julie Andrews in the film 10, where she says to Dudley Moore, "Do you want to make love or do you want to argue?" Moore's response is to argue. Maybe because he's English, I'm not sure. So when you think about all these contexts, when is it appropriate to engage in argumentation? When is it inappropriate? When is the problem that you know how to argue and the person you're arguing with is obviously going to have his or her needs not met because you're so good, because you're so comfortable in arguing that it becomes a weapon in the conflict or dispute. So that frequently you need to learn when to shut up, when not to engage in argument. I'm going to say a little bit about the problems with theorizing. But then after I do that, I want to talk about a kind of argument I never discussed. And that's arguments in philosophy. the people who have written about logic and argumentation were philosophers until recently, when the field was kidnapped by people in other disciplines. And you would think that the precedent and the experience they have with the arguments that generate philosophical problems in particular influence the way they thought about argumentation. And to me, influence and undermine the possibility or the need for a theory of argumentation. So my first subject of the 5 that are looking for a unifying theme is formal logic. And what I want to talk about are certain distinctions that come from formal logic that are fundamental to argument theory. One of those distinctions is between logic and content or subject. In particular is the idea that there's a certain pattern of correctness that depends on whether or not a piece of reasoning instantiates an argument form. Okay? An argument is valid just in case it's proof against any counterattack. And you can show that by showing that it has a certain form. So that is, immunizes the argument against somebody saying, well, your argument is of this form, which is clearly absurd, therefore it's obviously mistaken. And in this first section, I use 2 examples from experimental studies, one with illiterates and the other with students, not necessarily meaning a connection, although I think the experimenters did, in which both cases subjects made what were considered critical errors in their understanding of the principles of logic. First one had to do with illiterates. And my point, I'm going to go over this very quickly. My point is that in both cases, the experimenters wrongly assumed they knew the right answer. And they wrongly assumed that there was any basis to the assumption that the reasoning they talked about applied to any field outside of logic, outside of the logic classroom, outside of a very specialized environment in which logic makes sense, formal logic. So what I'm challenging is the presumption that logic has any applicability to fields other than itself. Can I get some more? I'm trying to connect this with a previous lecture about fields. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this example, but it impressed me when I first read it. It still impresses me. Experimenters, anthropologists went to Liberia, where people had, one of the dominant tribes there had just been given a written language, so that many of the adults were still illiterate. And they tried to determine whether illiteracy affected their logical powers. Okay? The presumption behind this is so absurd that I hope it's amusing to you. And how did they determine this? By giving them logic problems to solve. My favorite one, a subject or a series of subjects are asked the following problem. People in Monrovia, people in Liberia who own houses, pay house tax. Boyma doesn't. Did I say that right? People who own houses pay a house tax? Boyma doesn't pay a house tax. Does he own a house? And the answer they got was, yes, he's a tax collector. So he's exempted from paying the house tax. And you know what's striking about this? I thought, what a brilliant answer. This man, this subject, assumed that the questioner had a problem. That's a fatal error. The questioner was just trying to determine whether the guy's illiteracy was affecting his ability to reason. In other words, there's a basic sham in the premise of the experiment. Not being forthright and straightforward with the people that you're experimenting with. And of course this guy had never been to class, so didn't understand that you are asked to solve problems that are totally devoid of any interest. You don't have, well, how did he get 8 apples and 6 pears? How did that come about? That's not the point. Don't ask those kinds of questions. So, what I conclude from this, and this is the point that I'm really reaching for, that in order to understand it the way the experimenters wanted to understand it, you really had to know how a logical formula is supposed to be parsed. What does it mean to say that everybody who owns a house pays a house tax? Is this a law? Is this practice? How are we supposed to think about the data that you use in solving the problem? And the answer that I came up with is that what you're supposed to understand is that it's a formula in formal logic. And an instantiation, you're supposed to understand it the way that it's understood in formal logic. So of course there's no basis for the presumption that this applies anywhere else. The results of the experiment are completely invalid. A second example is even more interesting to me because psychologists have made so many careers off of this example. Are you familiar with the Watson selection task? I think an English artifact. Given to logic students, given to soldiers, given all over the world. You're told the following rule. If there's a vowel on one side of the card, there's an odd number on the other. And then you're told, face up. You're given 4, A, 7, and Q. Which cards do you have to turn over to see whether the rule is being observed? That's the Watson selection test. And nobody asked, rule? What does that mean? Card game? None of the details of this are important, and moreover, they don't tell the subjects, who basically do very badly on this. They don't give the answers that the experiment is expecting to give. No, I shouldn't say expect, because they hope that they would give bad answers. Because if they didn't, they would have been more forthright with them and said, look, I want you to figure this out. This is just a brain teaser. It's just a little brain knot for you to untie. Try to figure out what violates the rule, what you can't have in order for this to be so. In other words, try to find some way to state the problem which will actually help people to solve the problem. That little idea never occurred to people. And again, to me, the thing that's interesting about it is that it shows that what we're trying to do is assume that people already understand how logicians treat a formula of this sort. So how can you presume on the basis of this that these results apply to any field outside of formal logic? So what I'm saying is, extend this to a conclusion that I'm not entitled to, which is that the concepts and distinctions that are so critical in formal logic have no presumption outside of the logic classroom. Okay? That's subject number 1. Moving on, I go to subject number 2, which has to do with another crucial aspect of logical theory, which is far more important than the first one. That's the idea that in order to have an argument to examine, you need to restate it in premise-conclusion form. That is to say, an argument, if it is to be an argument, has to be a sequence of statements or propositions, all but one of which is going to be a premise, the last one is going to be a conclusion. I think there's a fatal flaw in that requirement, and the fatal flaw is that it eliminates the rhetorical context of the argument. In other words, it doesn't matter who's saying this. What matters is what the sequence of statements are. It doesn't matter what audience is being addressed. There is no audience. It's not being spoken to anybody. And if it's not being spoken to anybody, how are you supposed to understand it? And one of the most puzzling features of logic, and whether it's informal or formal, is the assumption that the reading of an argument, the understanding of it, is easy. The hard part is the appraisal of the argument. And it's exactly backwards. What's really hard is to understand what somebody's arguing. And if you do understand it, you're well on the way to finding out the right things to say about it. I don't say critically appraise it because that assumes that there's only one category of response, the one that involves sitting in judgment of the argument. So I have an example. The example, of course, is chosen to make my case. It has some features which maybe you might think of as atypical. It involves a letter to a advice to the lovelorn columnist. A woman wrote in saying that her daughter is having a baby and that she plans to have her 2-year-old son be there when she has the delivery. The grandma is appalled about this. And Abby writes back and says, I think it's a great idea. And so Martha, a registered nurse, writes back and says, you can't be serious. I've been to over 3,000 or 4,000 deliveries, and every time one of those supportive husbands dons a hospital gown to be with his wife, I am frightened that he's going to faint. Men in the delivery room are a pain in the neck. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Abby, we do not need hysterical kids and supportive husbands at delivery. Signed, Martha at St. John's. Now, why did I choose this example? You try putting this example into premise-conclusion form. Especially when it's perfectly obvious what sort of things you want to say about this argument. She's relying on her experience without telling us where the experience was acquired. If she had written, Martha, I've been to a lot of home deliveries, and I've been to a lot of deliveries at birth homes and birth centers where they do everything possible to make other family members welcome. And you know what? The family still screws up. She didn't say any of that because, of course, it never occurred to her that there was any other place where delivery could be done except the places that she went. It never occurs to her to ask, maybe I'm the problem. Maybe it's my attitude to the family members that at least I'm projecting onto them. I'm afraid they're going to behave badly. Well, I'm the one who's behaving badly because I'm afraid that they're going to behave badly. Now, my point initially is we don't need to put any of this into premise-conclusion form. What we need to do is think about how, for example, Martha is going to respond to this. And Martha's going to respond by saying, look, these people don't belong there. This is my job. I'm taking care of this woman. In other words, Martha is assuming that what she's dealing with is a medical procedure, and the only people who should be there are the patient, the pregnant woman, and the health professionals who are helping her. Okay? So as far as the analysis of the argument, it's the assumption that it's a medical procedure, the fact that she needed to be concerned more about what the woman wanted and less about her own convenience. These are critical comments that I think an informed and thoughtful reading, I'm crediting to myself, would give. And we don't need to talk about how to put it in the premise-conclusion form. But suppose we try to. Suppose we try to identify her conclusion. Is it, you aren't serious? That can't be it. Is it, I'm concerned about this? Because most of the things she says are, we don't need, without saying who we is. Or is she saying, I don't want you to encourage people to have family members watch a delivery at my hospital, where I'm going to do everything possible to make them miserable. None of that applies. The problem with the premise-conclusion thing is it leaves Martha out of it. It leaves what her experience, what her concerns, what her anxieties are, who she's talking to, all of that is left out. And so whatever we're going to do is going to end up being unfair to her. Is going to attribute to her positions on matters that she never even considered. The fact is that she has an anxiety or concern, but hasn't been able to formulate it in a way that is clear enough for us to state in premise-conclusion form. Is that clear? Lastly, what about the argument for things being in premise-conclusion form? I'm looking at my notes here, and I'll read you what I had to say about that because I don't remember what I had to say about it. That an argument is an argument only if somebody makes a claim and there is support for that claim. This is the argument for every argument has to have a premise-conclusion form. The claim is the conclusion. The support, which it must be possible to reformulate as a sequence of claims, constitutes the premises. So unless this premise-conclusion requirement can be satisfied, there is no argument. Now, of course, this argument is very hard to apply to Martha's letter unless you want to say she has no argument. And I think I would be very hard-pressed to say something that seems like almost a reductio ad absurdum of what I've just said. She's PO'd. I mean, she's really annoyed. She is arguing with Abby, taking issue with her, but she isn't giving an argument. Here we have a distinction which is part of an analysis, the distinction between giving an argument and really having one. Really having an argument is a fruit of an analysis, not something that we use in going into the analysis. After looking over the whole thing very carefully, we may want to decide, and I have some other examples of this later on, well, she didn't really have an argument. Yes, she was giving one, but it turned out when we thought about it and thought about what she could be saying, the argument may reduce to something like childbirth is a medical procedure and the only people that should be there are nurses and doctors, which of course she doesn't say. She talks about something entirely different, namely when husbands are there, I worry that they might faint. Doesn't say if that ever happened. An argument is a claim together with support for the claim. Is this a claim? Other possibilities suggest themselves. It's a definition, though it's unclear of what. It's a stipulation, in which case there's nothing to argue for. Perhaps it's best understood as a kind of directive to the analyst to aim for when he's restating or she's restating what the argument is saying in the premise-conclusion form. If so, then the directive is a good one. If it's a good one, does it really illuminate what was being argued? And I think that's the issue raised here. Is it really helpful to put something in premise-conclusion form? My own conviction is that what happens is that you have distorted and misrepresented the original argument in order for you to be able to use resources that you have after that's done. In other words, it's an aggressive and violent move. Logical theory depends on the assumption that everything we may learn when trying to give a reading can be incorporated into the restatement of the argument in premise-conclusion form. Then in that form, no reading is necessary. But this assumption is unwarranted because the giving of a critical reading is an essential part of the process of trying to understand what's being said. And if that's ruled out, then we have no way to understand the argument when it's restated in premise-conclusion form. So the problems with the theory of argument so far have to do with various assumptions that I think are unwarranted. That the identification of an argument is different from the critical reflection of on what is being argued. That the argument was stated in premise conclusion form can be understood on its own, independently of what the arguer was saying as revealed under critical analysis, and that the argument forms that are the subject of logical theory have any application outside of the theory of logical forms. In other words, that logical consideration can be confined to the relation between premise and conclusion. So I turn next to fallacy theory, which I thought originally had something to do with sex this morning, but it turns out it had nothing to do with that. There are things to theorize about fallacies, even when we ignore the rhetorical questions that arise, when we try to understand what an informal fallacy could be in relationship to premise-conclusion form, which is the question that Hammond and others asked when they said there's no theory of fallacy. How are we going to understand what a fallacy is in terms of what good reasoning would be? How are we going to understand it in terms of whether it seems to be correct or isn't correct? All of that is in relation to the premise conclusion. It seems to me that when it comes to the fallacies, an important lesson is that a fallacy may be referred to in the course of a critical analysis of what someone is arguing, or how she is arguing, not to establish that a mistake has been made, but as a kind of easy-to-remember diagnostic shorthand for what the analysis has revealed. In other words, don't try to isolate fallacy from analysis. And really, talk about fallacies is completely indispensable. And it's annoying to be told that you've committed a fallacy. So if that happens, drop it. This is especially true for the fallacies that are fallacies of imagination and empathy, which I'll get to in a minute. If you try to theorize about fallacies, there are obvious differences between them. The fallacy of intimidation, for example. That's a fallacy, but somehow the fallacy of being seductive or sexy isn't a fallacy, even though that's a far more effective way to win an argument than intimidation. So there's a kind of mixed bag under the heading of fallacies, which bothers fallacy theorists. Some of them tactics, strategies, errors in thinking, and even failures of imagination, which I'll be talking about. Is humor a fallacy? It's a very effective way of, half of the advertisements depend on humor. You have to wonder, why is the fact that jokes are being made an effective selling device? Well, obviously it's effective because it makes you like the commercial and you transfer your like to the product. Is it a mistake to be intimidated? Have you committed some kind of wrong? Well, it depends. Sometimes intimidation is pretty irresistible. I wouldn't blame somebody who was bullied and finally agreed to something. And I don't think there's much interest in theorizing about why bullying works. There are other fallacies which have to do with misconceptions of thinking. What I chose was the idea of the dice or the cards being hot. That is a mistake I have committed over and over and over again. Win a few hands and the cards are hot. You bet more and more, and then of course lose all your money. Because cards don't get hot, dice don't get hot. What happens is that you're fooled by the successful cluster or sequence into thinking that since it's not representative of what the odds say should happen, therefore something else has happened and it's going your way. That's a fallacy in thinking, a mistaken kind of thinking. Not a fallacy in argument. And it's very, very common. But it isn't a case where somebody has pulled the wool over your eyes. You're doing it to yourself. And it's hard to see how it's related to intimidation. And finally, and the most interesting set of fallacies by far are the ones that have to do with a failure of empathy and imagination. Straw man, begging the question, even false dichotomy and false dilemma. They're failures of imagination because you have failed to imagine what the other side is thinking. It's very difficult for us to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and see things the way they do. So of course, almost invariably, everybody's argument on a critical issue begs the question. Because they don't acknowledge what the issue is that divides them from the opposition, and they don't speak to that issue. It's not because they are bad thinkers. I call it a failure of imagination, and maybe a failure of empathy. What does that have to do with intimidation? What does that have to do? This is the end of my theorizing about the fallacies, that you can't find some way of collecting them all together and saying sensible things about them. But of course, I did a little theorizing. The real problem, however, is that of trying to focus on the fallacy independently of the analysis. And what is significant about it is that it ignores the role of the analyst. To me, what divides the different thinking in logic is the wish that the analyst not be a participant, stand outside of the argument. If you like, stand in judgment, adopt some kind of superior position. The analyst is not a participant in the argument, and I'm saying that is a fallacy. I've got an example. I'm not going to read it all. It has to do with the debate over the term pro-choice. I had some references to Stephen Gould in connection with this because he talks about the same issue. Somebody wrote in a letter saying, a euphemism. The use of a euphemism destroys your trust of the person who uses it. Pro-choice is a euphemism for pro-abortion. So people who claim to be pro-choice have lost the right to be heard. That's what this person wrote. Somebody else, I won't call him a wise guy, but somebody else wrote back and said, if I was pro-abortion, I would be in favor of abortions for all pregnancies, including the ones that people want to have a baby. Maybe this lack of fidelity to speech doesn't forfeit the right to be heard, but it certainly means that you're not going to be taken very seriously if you talk this way. Now, what's interesting about this is the second writer totally ignored the issue that was raised by the first author because he thought it was about the word pro-choice. That's not about the word pro-choice. What the guy said was, the label pro-choice avoids what really is at issue, namely the morality of the specific act of abortion. That's his terminology. In other words, what bothered the person is why somebody could define the issue in abortion in terms of somebody making a choice. Poole calls it choosing a cereal at the supermarket. Well, of course we have that right, so that we have the right to have an abortion. That's the way Poole was characterizing this defense. What's interesting about this is how easy it is to beg the question, and how easy it is to avoid taking responsibility as a critic for saying what's at issue. There's no argument about the right to be taken seriously. How can you forfeit that right? What kind of right is that? That was my first example, okay? And the point I'm trying to make is that in talking about the fallacy, false dichotomy is the other fallacy involved here, the idea that either you're opposed to all abortions or you're in favor of abortions for all pregnancies. Those are clearly not the only two alternatives. And the alternative that the first guy really had in mind was pro-abortion as short for pro the position that an abortion is not murder, or something like that. The second argument I got from Jamie White, and this is an argument about, I think it happened in New Zealand, something called the chaplain's chat. Not fundamentalists, but evangelicals. I mean, that's the way they call themselves. And the chaplain at this university had a column in the newspaper called the Chaplain's Chat that was addressed to fellow evangelicals and well, pastoral advice. And the newspaper started printing something called the Egyptian Chaplain's Chat, which consisted of information about ancient Egyptian religion. The evangelicals were pissed. And they wrote back asking that the column be removed. White says, oh, and the editor, in defending including the column, I left out the best part, the editor including the column, and for including the column said, tolerance requires that we print the Egyptian chaplain's chat. And White's comment on this is that the editor was begging the question because he failed to understand the fundamentalist, now let me use that term as you'll see for a reason, the fundamentalist position that anything that is different from their views is blasphemy and will send us to hell. This is White talking, not the editor. In other words, the issue is really whether something so offensive to this part of the student body could be printed in the paper. Now you think about it. Obviously, these people would have had no objection to the rabbi's chat or the imam's chat in the newspaper if there was a constituency for it. What bothered them was there are no Egyptian religion students at this university. This column was printed to make fun of the other column. He somehow missed that. These guys were not protesting on theological grounds. They couldn't take the joke. And you know, I understand where they're coming from because they're going to say, and you know what they're going to say. If you had a rabbi's chat and then the Egyptian chaplain's chat, don't you think the Jewish students would say, this is anti-Semitic? Of course that's what they would say, because it would be intended to make fun of them. Now, don't ask me why a chaplain has a column in a student newspaper. That does seem odd. But it's interesting that in thinking about begging the question, look at the things you have to think about. What is really the concern here? What bothers the people who are the potential audience for this? You've got to include the audience. You've got to think about their kind of reaction. You've got to think about what really divides the different sides to this dispute. I had some remarks about pragma dialectics, which were superseded by the Egyptian chaplain's chat, so I'm going to talk on them. I want to turn now to my fourth topic, rhetoric, and Chaim Perlman's theories. Because in talking about a critic or an analyst, which I've been emphasizing throughout this paper, Perlman's insight is that we constitute ourselves a special kind of audience. Not a particular audience, say, of people who are in favor or opposed to our position, but an audience that we become when we try to be thoughtful critics. When we try to anticipate different reactions by different sides, when we sort of are part of the argument but also outside of it. He called that a universal audience. And the Perlman's work is interesting because it rejoins a debate which Plato started in the Gorgias when he compared the sophist rhetoric with the skills of a chef, and said, the fact that food is very tasty has nothing to do with its nutritional value. Now, actually, I think that's wrong. Especially if you've been eating the processed food that you, well, you probably don't have it, but that we have in America, which is basically processed corn syrup and corn product. But anyway, the fact that food tastes good has nothing to do with its nutritional value. The fact that an argument is persuasive has nothing to do with its merits. The persuasiveness and correctness are unrelated to one another. It's a big division that occurred in our field between rhetoric and logic. And I won't say at that precise moment because Aristotle is a giant in both fields. But the idea that as logicians, we don't need to talk to anybody. All we need to sit down and write out the argument in premise, conclusion form. That's what Perlman is bothered by. The need to include the audience as an essential part of understanding an argument. What is it saying to the audience it picked out? How would that audience respond? How would we respond to that audience? And so on. I have an example in here, naturally. This one is from an American you probably never heard of, Rush Limbaugh. It's hard not to like Rush Limbaugh. This is from a logic textbook called Logic and Mr. Limbaugh. And the conceit of this textbook is that he's going to go, only Limbaugh is offered as an example. He has about 30 or 40 examples from a book of his, or several books. My example is from a book called See, I Told You So. And each time, surprise, each time Limbaugh screws up. Each time he commits a glaring fallacy. He doesn't have Noam Chomsky, for example, in this book, or somebody on the other side. Although God knows Chomsky could have been used as well, but been more interesting. This is about political correctness. This is what Limbaugh wrote. This is all we're told in the textbook. The politically correct view of old Christopher Columbus today is that he brought nothing to the peaceful New World paradise but oppression, disease, brutality, and genocide. As a resident of Hawaii, this interests me because Hawaii is all about contact between Captain Cook and other English people and then the American colonists. But life was far from utopian long before Columbus. In fact, while there were certain atrocities against Indians by white people, there were just as many, and probably to a greater degree of savagery, committed by other Indians. Now, obviously, we know the particular. This book is not written for me. It's written for his followers, who are called, by the way, ditto heads. Wonderful name. And they can be counted on to agree with him. They're a cheering section. They identify an attack on anything liberal, especially, and this was the issue that he was concerned with, changing the curriculum to include materials of a non-Western variety, maybe non-male as well. The author of this textbook thinks he knows what Limbaugh is arguing, even though he doesn't reflect on the rhetoric of it. He doesn't reflect on who the audience is and what he could be saying to them. He says he's defending Western civilization against political correctness, and that's true. However, he goes wrong when he restates Limbaugh's argument in argument, premise, conclusion form, and does so without a trace of irony. Here's what he comes up with. The Indians in 1492 were at least as savage to each other as the white people were to them. Therefore, the politically correct view that Columbus brought nothing but oppression, disease, brutality, and genocide to a peaceful people is untrue. What's the fallacy here? It's a strong. He's attacking the view that nobody holds that the Indians were completely peaceful. And that's certainly irrelevant to the conclusion he should have been attacking, namely that Columbus did terrible things. The irony to me is in how illogical and unfair, I should say, almost brutal, this restatement is to Limbaugh and his argument. The fact is that the people reading this couldn't care less about Columbus, certainly aren't defenders of Spanish colonialism. They hate the Spaniards, you know. What concerns them is the attack on individualism, capitalism, and Christianity, which Limbaugh and they see as the focus of the emphasis on multicultural. I'm not going to go on much more. What I'm saying here about this, what I'm saying is that you need to think about who he's talking to and what he's saying to those people. And that is Perlman's strength, bringing in rhetorical considerations. That's where the analogy between the food and the argument breaks down. I have some more remarks about Limbaugh, but I want to move on. What's interesting to me is the concept that Perlman introduces as a substitute for logical correctness, and that's the adherence of an audience. What he's saying is, instead of correctness, if an argument commands the adherence of the universal audience, you constitute yourself when you become a thoughtful critic. That's the best you can hope for. We don't need logical correctness because that introduces standards from without. But we can get almost as much from thinking about us becoming universal audiences, and then whether we adhere to our own analysis. That's where the tricky part comes in. Did I adhere to what I said about David's letters about pro-choice earlier? Or about Limbaugh's argument? Or about Martha at St. John's? If I was pressed about it, I would have to say that I'm aware of how other analyses may require me to revise my own. However, after giving my reading, after I've made my criticism, where does the idea of audience adherence even play a role? I understand the motivation to draw attention to who I am and what I'm doing in making the analysis, and asking how good I am at making that analysis. But where is there a part for my somehow manifesting the fact that I was convinced by my own analysis? In fact, why speak of it as an audience at all when all it comes to is just critical analysis? And why does he need the adherence part of it? Plato, it would seem, offered a false dichotomy: argument correctness or argument persuasion. Logical theory opts for the former, and Perlman is right to be critical of that choice, but why opt for either alternative? The focus is not on the need to choose between argument or audience, but with a focus on correctness itself. That focus seems to emphasize the importance of sitting in judgment on something, and when that emphasis is dropped, we're left with a critical analysis that utilizes any number of different terms of appraisal. That's a good point, that's insightful, and so on. The question of the validity of the reading itself is still an open one, whenever you give a reading. That question doesn't require us to become a different audience. It only means that we should try to rethink what we said about the argument, perhaps by inviting others to read and think about it, or for us to try to imagine they're doing so. Now, I have a section here which I'm not going to read because I've used up my water, about the illusion created that you understand argumentation from philosophical argumentation. My conviction is that we philosophers are very bad at critical analysis. we're very bad at understanding our own arguments. And one reason that we're bad about it is because philosophical argumentation is so peculiar. We actually think that the arguments, especially the famous arguments, say, for skepticism about the external world, or the example I chose with dreaming, that we can look at an argument without asking, does it have an audience? Could you ever say to somebody, or find somebody saying after they woke up from a dream, oh my God, it did it again. I got fooled again. Can you imagine saying to somebody what the dreaming argument seems to say? Well, maybe you're only dreaming at this time. Maybe you're only dreaming that you're at this time. Of course, it may be that good that you're saying, wow, this has got to be a dream because nothing in real life could ever be as good. But you see, my point is that if you think argument in philosophy as non-problematic, let me put it in a generous way, you're overlooking the fact that what makes it distinctive is the fact that we understand, or imagine ourselves, understanding the crucial claims behind any kind of argument without having to supply an audience for it. That is, we don't have to imagine saying that we're seeing this cat. We don't have to imagine saying that the murder and rape of a 6-year-old girl is wrong, as though somehow the killer was provoked by overreacting. We don't have to think about what possible audience it could be directed at and what it could be saying to that. We don't have to try to understand what it's saying. So my final section was an attempt to undermine the impetus for the development of theory of argumentation by saying, let's be truthful. It's all based on what we're most familiar with, arguments in philosophy, and we have no clue what they are. They're the worst possible place to start. Now, once somebody prepared a logic text, I'm sure you've never seen it, in which he took some of the most famous arguments in philosophy and laid them out in premise-conclusion form. I think Berkeley's argument against matter took 45 premises. And I guarantee you, nothing, any illuminating value resulted from this analysis. He didn't understand what Berkeley was doing at all. I think he also had cogito in there too. That was only 27 premises. So let me read my conclusion. And my conclusion is called Note to Theory. I've been doing a lot of theorizing about why there's nothing to theorize about. Much of it was about the theorizing of others. The logicians, the fallacy people, Perlman. But even when I did make some theoretical observations, for example, about different fallacies, no logical theorist would accuse me of trying to develop a theory. And I don't think I'm vulnerable to the more general criticism that I tried to develop a theory of argumentation in general. Yes, I theorize, but no, I've not undermined my case for there being a theory of argumentation, for there being nothing to theorize in connection with the development of such a theory. Nice for me to make this announcement. You won't have to question me about it. Let me make it clear that I have no animus toward theorizing, provided, of course, there is something to theorize about. The popularity of reality shows. How interesting to develop a theory about that. A theory about what's going to happen in your election. I imagine several of you have theories about that. As lawyers, lawyers often develop theories of a crime as an essential point of preparing a defense or preparing a prosecution. And of course, theories are the bread and butter of scientific experimentation. No point in performing an experiment unless you have a theory about the way it might turn out that you're testing. But the idea that logical theory is comparable to a scientific theory seems to me problematic because it assumes there is something to theorize about. Perhaps we should consider whether an argument for the need for a theory can be developed independently of the different theories we've been discussing. Why have a theory? One answer is that the very existence of logical theory is due to the fact that certain conflicts, including conflicts over arguments in philosophy, seem intractable. So there's a need for an impartial way of determining which arguments are acceptable and which are not. I'm putting it in a way that makes it seem implausible. This idea of non-involved or non-participating judge or tamper-proof validating procedure has been the object of criticism in this paper. Of course, it's hard to imagine why the parties to the dispute would give so much power to the logical theorists. And there's every reason to question what the theorist is doing in seeming to want to acquire that power. The power over validating or invalidating somebody's argument. A more serious suggestion is that the theory is needed to help people to become better critics of argumentation. This is written really because of Powell's paper. Or to give better arguments themselves. I've already suggested, I don't know what I've suggested here, that logicians and philosophers are mistaken if they think they're better at it than people without that training. Something like the experimenters and the illiterates. For one thing, a knowledge of the subject matter of the argument seems essential. And if logical theory is encouraging us to believe otherwise, then it's doing more harm than good. It also is essential when it comes to identifying what divides the parties to the dispute, to understand the concerns and even interests of the parties, to know something about the history and the development of the conflict, and so on. For another, the assumption that there are what Truman calls field-invariant concepts or criteria seems unwarranted. That these criteria seem to exist in many logical theories should make them wonder whether they are mistakenly supposing that how things look from where they are in their studies and classrooms is how things really are. There are valuable lessons when it comes to the analysis of argumentation, and much of what may seem to have been theorizing on my part has really been taken the form of how to think critically. Try to see things as the arguers do. Try to identify what really divides them, and so on. The idea that a theory is helpful in teaching such lessons is perhaps a key rationale for the need for logical theory. However, to know how to think critically requires knowing how to think for yourself. Techniques, concepts, and other theoretical items of the theoretical apparatus should not be doing the thinking for you. I submit that this is just what logical theory is designed to do, to make it unnecessary for the critic to have to think for herself, or at the very least to minimize what she has to do for herself. This is perhaps the final irony when it comes to logical theory, namely that it seems to be an expression of a desire to relieve us of the burden of doing much thinking on our own. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for what I thought was a really lovely talk. The thing which I kept on thinking during
I'm scared.
the thing which I kept on thinking during the talk was that actually quite a lot of what you were saying seems to me to have fairly direct relevance to the, I think, terribly important question of how do philosophers actually proceed, what is the nature of philosophical argumentation when it's done well. So, for example, your remarks, why assume that formal logic has any application outside the classroom? And I take it that the classroom is actually the formal logic classroom, yes, not even the philosophy classroom, or something like that. Seems to be exactly the kind of thought that Wittgenstein had again and again. The point that the hard part is the understanding of the arguing, not the appraisal of it. And your wonderful points about how, of course, people are committing the straw man fallacy and begging the question and so on all the time. Very much reminded me, among others, of Peter Winch's work. And in general terms, the so-called therapeutic reading of Wittgenstein, the new readers of Wittgenstein and so on, it seems to me that what we, speaking as one of them, essentially wants to do is say, look, what philosophy is or ought to be about is exactly trying to understand what the other person, or indeed oneself, is wanting to say, and how incredibly difficult that is to do in philosophy. That's what it's all about. And this is a conception of philosophy which can be drawn to some extent from historical predecessors such as pragmatism and Nietzsche, but runs very much against the mainstream in the history of philosophy. Now, my question is well, you may want to comment on that, but my question is this. For Wittgenstein, one extremely important part of this is, as he remarks in a couple of places, that philosophical problems at the end of the day tend to be problems more of the will than of the intellect. My concern about some of the examples you developed, which were very intriguing, what the second guy said about being pro-abortion, which I found very helpful, actually, what he said, and your remarks about Rush Limbaugh. My concern is that aren't you in danger of, in practice, buying into a kind of relativism with regard to these kinds of cases, and actually ending up being, for example, too soft on Limbaugh? Because isn't the problem with, for example, Limbaugh's followers precisely that they're not willing to do what you recommended at the end of the talk, and they're not willing to do what Wittgenstein recommended, namely to go beyond a certain kind of intellectual framework which they're happily, comfortably within, and actually asking themselves the hard questions about what they want to believe and what they don't want to believe. And isn't there a danger that the way that you characterize the pro-choice, pro-abortion debates and the Limbaugh example and so on, isn't the danger that you're actually getting to a position where you're kind of saying something like, okay, so in this sphere of conversation or interaction between human beings or whatever, that is what counts as a good argument, and that's all we can say about that.
Are you running for office? You know why I say that? You know why I say that? I don't want to beat up on Limbaugh, and I don't see the point in that. I'm not necessarily in favor of sitting down with ditto heads and talking to them, or Murdoch, since Murdoch's spirit hovers over all of us. But it doesn't seem to me to be any point in kicking and hitting and fighting Limbaugh and his supporters. It would be far more appealing to me to validate them on some level. And if you can't find a way to validate them, to take what they're saying seriously enough for them to think that you listen to them, that you hear them, then what's the point of even paying attention to them, except for the political purpose of ostracizing or destroying or eliminating the oxycodone supply that he's dependent on?
Well, the answer might be that, for example, occasionally people get the chance to debate with Limbaugh,
yes,
and with people on Vox News and so on and so forth. And it's very interesting to see the kinds of things that actually work when people get the chance to do that.
Work
and
for whom? Work for whom?
Well,
work for you and me, but it doesn't work for his disciples. It never does. When I was a little bit younger, the dream of glory of every liberal was to beat William F. Buckley in the debate. It's something similar. And philosophers in the droves would appear on TV and try to beat him. And I don't think they ever succeeded. For one thing, they never had his repertory of mannerisms, which were extraordinarily distracting. He won every argument. He had all these things. And that, when you're talking about winning or losing in the media, on public, it's totally different. It's all show business.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
No, I don't think it's true that...
See, that's what I said about politics. That's why I said that. I'm not in politics.
I think that's a questionable rhetorical move.
Of course it is.
I like the way you deliberately make these questionable rhetorical moves, wanting us to notice them. But that nevertheless shouldn't lead us to be convinced by them, obviously. So it's not true that people never have their minds changed. I mean, there are...
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Well, that these people, ditto heads, whatever, never have their minds changed. There are fascinating examples of people who've written books about their journey, for example, from being, card-carrying conservatives and so on, to being something else. There's an amazing book, for example, recently called Confessions of an Economic Hitman, about somebody who used to be a true believer and isn't anymore. Now, That is my slight worry is simply, aren't you making it a bit too easy to say, we shouldn't even try to make it easier for people like that to make a change?
Maybe. I don't, one of the things you're talking about, people are converted, one of the things that is so frightening are the converts from being far left-wing to being reactionary right-wing. Those people are the most intractable. In fact, I remember recently there was a letter from somebody who was stigmatized as a neocon, and he said, I've always been a neocon. I was never a liberal, so I'm not a neocon. I'm not neo. I'm old. But I think the question behind the issue that you're really raising is what sort of values should inform our critical analysis? And one perfectly legitimate value is I want to crush the opposition. I want everybody to realize what idiots these people are. I don't say that's totally illegitimate. But in the context in which we're developing a theory of argumentation, writing a book which says, here is a manual for crushing your opposition, I would advise the use of every fallacy in the book if you were going to do that. Because they work wonderfully well. Intimidation, terrific way of winning an argument. It's also a great way to get divorced, but, it's a terrific way to win an argument. So, it depends on the values that are